Hello, everyone, and welcome to the lecture on one of the most interesting figures of 20th century Russian literature, Isaak Emanuilovich Babel. Isaak Babel was born in Moldavanka, which is the Jewish quarter of Odessa, in 1894. So he came from a very different background than most of the other authors that we've studied in this course. Most obviously, of course, he's Jewish, and not only is he Jewish, and Ukrainian too, of course, but he grew up in what was specifically sort of a Jewish ghetto. Moldavanka was kind of a poor, high crime area that was predominantly Jewish, at least in parts of it, and so he grew up, he wasn't poor. His family was reasonably well off for residents of that region, but he was not rich, he was not noble, and he spent a lot of time in kind of a less savory part of the city and part of the empire. So Odessa in general is seen to be a high crime area and is known as the mother of thieves because it produced so much crime. And so these twin facts about his biography, his Jewish heritage and upbringing, and his association with this high crime area are something that we see reflected very noticeably in his writing. So if you recall, we've already had one writer of Jewish background that we've read here, which is Mandelstam. But Babel's life was quite different from Mandelstam's. Mandelstam, if you recall, was able to go to school despite the quota on Jewish students in Russian schools, and he was able to move to St. Petersburg despite the restrictions on Jews about leaving the Pale of Settlement. But because Mandelstam's family was so well-to-do and so well-connected, they were able to overcome those obstacles. Babel's family was not. He originally could not get into the local school because of the quota on Jewish students, and so he studied at home. And similarly, he was not admitted to his first choice university, Odessa University, because of the quota, and he ended up going to Kiev instead. So he did receive a university education in Kiev, and then he moved illegally to Petrograd in 1915. So at the time, the Pale of Settlement was still in effect. And if you recall from the lecture on Mandelstam, the Pale of Settlement was a law restricting where Jewish citizens could live. Mostly they were confined to the western outskirts of the empire, and they were not allowed in Petrograd or St. Petersburg. Mandelstam's family, again, was able to get a special dispensation to move to St. Petersburg. Babel did not get such a special dispensation, but he just moved anyway. And of course, at the time, things were pretty chaotic, and I guess no one noticed, and he was just able to move to Petrograd and live there. So an interesting thing about Babel was that he was fluent not just in Russian, but also in French and Yiddish. The Yiddish is expected, the French less so, but by the time he was a teenager, he was already fluent in French and actually started writing in French, not in Russian or Yiddish. So his first stories were written in French. Unfortunately, we don't have any of those stories. They were all lost, or possibly he destroyed them. He was a master craftsman, as we'll later discuss, and may have been embarrassed by his earlier stories. He managed to get published quite early, however, and his first story, Old Shloime, was published in 1913. After moving to Petrograd in 1915 or 1916, he met Maxim Gorky, the leading sort of Bolshevik Soviet writer. And Maxim Gorky had a tremendous effect on his career, just like he had on many other authors. So Maxim Gorky worked not only as a writer himself, but he encouraged and protected other authors. And he encouraged Babel to write. And Babel later said that that was a turning point in his career to have the encouragement of someone like Gorky. It really helped him keep writing. He spent the last years of World War I and the Revolution period we're not even sure what exactly he was up to all of the time. He was working as a journalist part of the time. He apparently enlisted in a Romanian division and served on the front during World War I, but then he deserted after the revolution and was again working as a journalist, and he ended up kind of hooking up with the powers that be in the propaganda department, the Soviet propaganda department, and he was assigned to work as a war correspondent and political officer for the Red Cavalry during the Soviet-Polish War of 1920. This turned out to be a formative experience because he kept diaries of his experiences while he was working as a war correspondent and political officer, and he then wrote a series of short stories based on his actual experiences with the Red Cavalry. And these short stories were first published in the early 1920s with Mayakovsky's journal Lev, and then published in the mid-1920s as an independent collection called Canarmia, or Red Cavalry. And they vaulted Babel onto the literary scene and won him considerable literary praise. He revealed himself to be, as I said, an absolutely master craftsman and a master of the short story genre. They also got him a lot of political condemnation. Apparently Budyonny, the general of the Red Cavalry, asked for his execution. He was so angry at Babel's depiction of life in the Red Cavalry. And Babel had a very ambiguous depiction of life in the Red Cavalry and life in the new Soviet regime. His character, Lutyev, who is extremely autobiographical, but not completely autobiographical. So Babel was another author who was working in this semi-autobiographical genre where he wrote fiction that was closely based on his own experiences, but was not 100% autobiographical. And people make mistakes sometimes thinking that Babel's stories are completely autobiographical and they ascribe the things that happen to this in the stories to Babel's own life experiences. Some of that's true and some of it's not. So you want to be very careful. He's working in this very kind of slippery genre, this very thin line between autobiography and fiction. In any case, his main character has this very ambiguous relationship with the Red Cavalry. Like Babel himself, he's an intellectual and probably Jewish, and he doesn't fit in very well amongst the Cossacks. He desperately wants to fit in amongst the Cossacks, but has a really hard time bringing himself to do the things necessary to fit in amongst the Cossacks. And eventually he realizes that he will never really be a Cossack. This, of course, is deeply ironic or tragic, or ironically tragic or tragically ironic, because the Cossacks, as we know, were the prime instrument of repression of the Jewish population in Russia. And so Babel's character desperately wants to turn his back on his Jewish heritage and become one of the oppressors or the overlords, or however you want to put it, but he can't bring himself to do it. So these short stories, they're all short stories, all very short stories, are incredibly compressed. They tend to be bittersweet, sometimes quite brutal, sometimes amusing and brutal. And like I said, they won him both tremendous acclaim and tremendous condemnation. At about the same time, starting in the early 1920s, Babel also wrote a series of short stories about pre-revolutionary Moldavanka, the place where he was born. And they were gathered together and published as a collection in 1931 under the name Odessa Tales, or Odesskiy Raskazy. They all feature Benya Krik, who is the gangster king of Moldavanka. And Benya Krik is considered to be one of the best characters of 20th century Russian fiction. He's like I said, the gangster king of Moldavanka. He, like Babel's character in Red Cavalry Tales, is Jewish but has a very ambiguous relationship with his heritage and sort of fantasizes about leaving it behind. And he acts in a way that we might not expect. It doesn't really fulfill American stereotypes about Jewish characters because, as I said, he's a gangster. It does, however, fulfill Russian stereotypes about Odessa because Odessa, like I said, is the mother of thieves. It's the crime capital of the Russian Empire. And these tales, these Odesskiy Raskazy, were once again hailed as being examples of master craftsmanship and incredible examples of the craft of writing short stories, they're also seen as founding the genre of Adyesa humor. So Babel was really the first, or one of the very first authors to write these sort of black humor tales, frequently featuring Jewish characters set in southern Russia and Ukraine. This became a popular genre later in the century. Later in the 20s and on into the 1930s, Babel turned more and more to stage writing and screenwriting, and he wrote a number of plays and screenplays, including he turned Zakat, or Sunset, one of the Odessa tales, into a play and a screenplay. Unfortunately, however, the increasing repression of the 1930s meant that he wrote and published less and less. So a number of the plays and screenplays that he wrote were not produced, or, for example, one screenplay that he wrote, he was then later taken off the credits because he was out of favor, and so he wrote less and less and was able to publish less and less. He was the one who made the famous remark after the adoption of socialist realism in 1934 that they've only taken away one freedom, the freedom to write badly, which of course is a devastating remark because writing badly is the most important freedom that an author can have. And he also said as the decade progressed that he was practicing the genre of silence. So unfortunately, he did not write a huge amount, or he did not publish a huge amount. He did write a huge amount, or rather, it would be better to say that he only wrote a few stories, but he rewrote them over and over again. As part of his meticulous craftsmanship, he would rewrite each story many times. And so because of that, he was not very productive at a time when authors were encouraged to churn out lots of propaganda and pulp fiction. He was trying to meticulously craft his short stories, which was yet another reason why he was unpopular with the authorities. Like many of the authors of this generation, his final years were tragic. In May 1939, he was arrested and accused of Trotskyism, terrorism, and spying for Austria and France, all of which, of course, were ridiculous accusations, but it was not uncommon for people, especially authors, to be accused of things that were just totally outside of the realm of possibility. Many Jews were accused of Trotskyism, although anyone could be accused of Trotskyism, but because Trotsky was Jewish, other Jews who were arrested were often accused of Trotskyism, even if there was absolutely no reason to suspect them of that. Terrorism, of course, was ridiculous, and then spying for Austria and France, also completely ridiculous. But those kind of accusations were common at the time. A few days after his original arrest, he confessed, most likely under severe torture. So the interrogators who were assigned to him were known for being particularly brutal, even by the standards of the NKVD at the time. But he did confess to everything they accused him of, and also implicated a number of other authors in the same plot. But he then retracted his confession both while he was in jail and then later during his trial, and insisted that he had confessed under duress, he had lied, none of that was true. Unfortunately, that had no effect. Of course, he was tried and immediately executed by firing squad in January of 1940. And for a long time, no one knew exactly what had happened to him or when exactly he had died or under what circumstances, because all that was kept secret, but we did eventually discover it later. He was rehabilitated, that is to say, his memory or his a career was rehabilitated, and in 1954, a year after Stalin's death, he was officially rehabilitated, and his works began being published again in the USSR and were republished several times in the Soviet period. So what was Babel's literary legacy? He was, as I mentioned, the master of the very short story. Most of his stories were quite short. He considered anything over 15 pages to be just unbearably long and watered down and just not good. And so he wrote incredibly short stories, although he rewrote them many times. And so he ended up with huge piles of manuscripts where he'd have, like, there's one story of him producing 100+ pages and being asked, like, oh my God, are you working finally on a novel? Are we about to see the great Babel novel? He was like, no, this is just all my drafts of my current short story. And so he was, like I said, a meticulous craftsman who wrote these incredibly compressed, amazing short stories. And that's probably his primary legacy as far as his specifically literary legacy. But he also had the important effect of chronicling the Red Cavalry's 1920 campaign in Poland in a way that no one else did, and in a way that few authors have done before or since, as far as chronicling a Russian military campaign. He introduced the genres of what we might call Jewish writing, or Ukrainian and Odessa writing, and Odessa humor to Russian literature. So he was the first major writer to write about specifically Jewish characters, Jewish milieu, Jewish setting, Jewish culture, and also Odessa characters, Odessa setting, Odessa milieu. And while he was doing this, he explored issues of ethnicity and identity in a way that was new to Russian literature. So most of the authors that we've surveyed, and most of the authors in general who were published prior to this, were from the dominant culture or joined the dominant culture. So, for example, Mandelstam was also Jewish, but he converted to Christianity in order to get into college. And so there's nothing particularly Jewish about Mandelstam's writing. Mandelstam is extremely interested in world culture. And so Mandelstam wrote some stuff about Russian culture. He also wrote a lot about European culture, and he's definitely this cosmopolitan, high culture writer. Babel was specifically focused on depicting Jewish culture and low culture. And so almost all of his characters are Jewish. He wrote about Moldavanka and the Jewish community in Odessa in a way that no one had before. And he also explored the issues of being in a non-dominant or non-prestige culture and being torn between the desire to assimilate into the dominant or prestige culture and the desire to preserve your own non-dominant, non-prestige, oppressed culture. This was something that had a lot of resonance for Russian readers at the time, especially as kind of a new and exciting thing. It also continues, I think, to have a lot of resonance for American readers in particular because of his explorations of mixed ethnicity, being torn between two different ethnicities, torn between two different cultures, trying to find your culture and trying to fit in. His themes continue to be evergreen for American readers, even though, of course, he was not writing for American readers, but his experience was one that fits in very well with the American immigrant experience. And so that is perhaps one of the reasons why he continues to be read so widely in the West as well as in Russia.